The story of Salitto Sakakibara is a chilling chapter in Japan's history of crime, one that continues to haunt both the community of Kobe and the nation at large. His case is not only remembered for the horrific nature of the acts he committed but also for the unsettling questions it raised about youth violence, mental health, and the criminal justice system. What shocked the public most wasn't just the brutality of the crimes but the age of the perpetrator, a boy only 14 years old. Before we get down to business, we want to hear your opinion. Write to us in the comments, what is your name and from which city are you watching us? Your support is very important to us. We will be grateful if you like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for participating with us in this important project. In the spring of 1997, the name Salitto Sakakibara became synonymous with terror, though at the time, the public only knew him as Boy A. Japanese laws protecting the identities of juvenile offenders prevented his name from being revealed initially. Instead, his actions told a horrifying story, making headlines and dominating public discourse. 2 children were dead, brutally murdered, and Sakakibara had left taunting messages behind that mocked law enforcement and hinted at his thirst for further violence. The case began with 2 separate crimes, each shocking in its cruelty and senselessness. The first victim, a 10-year-old girl, was attacked and killed in March 1997. The community was devastated but believed this could be an isolated incident. Then, just 2 months later, an even more horrifying event took place, the murder of an 11-year-old boy named Jun Hayes. Sakakibara not only killed him but also desecrated his body, leaving his severed head at the entrance of a local school as a grim warning to the public. The media frenzy that followed painted a grim picture of a community in fear. Parents clung tightly to their children, schools implemented stricter security measures, and Kobe, a city still recovering from the devastating 1995 earthquake, found itself thrust into a new kind of crisis. Rumors spread quickly, with wild speculations about the killer's identity. Was it an adult with a grudge? A drifter? Nobody could have guessed the perpetrator was a young boy who lived quietly among them. What truly set this case apart was the calculated nature of the crimes. Sakakibara did not act in a moment of passion or desperation, he planned every step. The note he left in Jun Hayes' mouth, written in red ink, was a clear declaration of intent. It read, "This is the beginning of the game." The message included taunts to the police and threats of more violence to come. Signed with his alias, Salitto Sakakibara, the note became a chilling symbol of his deliberate and sinister mindset. The public reacted with a mixture of horror and fascination. How could someone so young commit acts so heinous? How had he managed to evade capture despite leaving such bold clues behind? The police faced immense pressure to find the killer, and the community demanded answers. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this was not the work of an impulsive individual. Sakakibara's crimes were methodical, and his ability to evade detection spoke to a disturbing level of cunning. In many ways, the anonymity of Boy A added to the fear. The people of Kobe were left wondering, was the killer among them? Could it be someone they knew? The lack of answers created a climate of suspicion, with some accusing neighbors or even strangers of being the culprit. Meanwhile, Sakakibara, hiding in plain sight, watched the chaos unfold, relishing the control he believed he had over the situation. For the police, the case was a race against time. They knew the killer's escalation posed a significant risk to the community. Each day that passed without an arrest deepened the fear that Sakakibara would strike again. Yet, despite his apparent confidence, small cracks in his carefully constructed facade would eventually lead to his capture. Salitto Sakakibara's name is now etched into the annals of Japanese criminal history, not just as a reminder of the crimes he committed but as a symbol of the darkness that can sometimes hide behind even the most ordinary faces. This chapter marked the beginning of one of Japan's most infamous true crime stories, a tragedy that would leave a lasting scar on the nation. To understand the darkness that consumed Salitto Sakakibara, one must look to the early years of his life. Born in 1982 in Kobe, Japan, Sakakibara grew up in a household that appeared, at least on the surface, to be ordinary. However, beneath this facade lay the seeds of dysfunction and instability that would later influence his path. Sakakibara was the youngest of 3 children, and his family lived in a quiet residential neighborhood. His father, though outwardly disciplined and hardworking, was emotionally distant and strict, often enforcing rigid rules in the household. Sakakibara's mother, by contrast, was highly critical and overbearing, placing immense pressure on her children to excel academically and socially. This dynamic created an environment where love and affection were scarce, replaced instead by high expectations and an underlying current of tension. From an early age, Sakakibara exhibited troubling behavior. While his older siblings were regarded as well-behaved and high-achieving, Sito stood out as unpredictable and volatile. He showed signs of aggression as a child, sometimes lashing out at classmates or destroying objects in fits of anger. Teachers and neighbors described him as a problem child, though these early red flags were often dismissed as a phase of youthful mischief. By the time he entered elementary school, Sakakibara's struggles became more pronounced. He had difficulty forming friendships and was frequently the target of bullying due to his erratic behavior. Other children found him strange and avoided him, exacerbating his feelings of isolation. He began to withdraw into his own world, finding solace in dark fantasies that seemed to fuel his growing resentment toward others. One of the most alarming aspects of Sakakibara's childhood was his fascination with violence. While other children played with toys or watched cartoons, Sakakibara preferred books and movies that depicted graphic scenes of murder and cruelty. He collected magazines that showcased grotesque imagery and often sketched disturbing pictures of mutilated animals and bloody weapons. These drawings, discovered later, would reveal a glimpse into the mind of a boy already grappling with dark urges. Sakakibara's relationship with his family deteriorated as he grew older. His father's strict discipline turned to outright hostility when Sito failed to meet expectations, while his mother's constant criticisms only deepened his sense of inadequacy. At home, he felt like an outsider, unloved and unwanted. This sense of alienation pushed him further into the violent fantasies that offered him a twisted sense of control and power. One particularly telling incident occurred when Sakakibara was only 10 years old. He killed a small bird with his bare hands and then displayed the corpse to his classmates, grinning as they recoiled in horror. When confronted about the act, he showed no remorse, instead expressing curiosity about the bird's death and the reactions it elicited. This lack of empathy was a chilling indicator of the person he would later become. As he transitioned into adolescence, Sakakibara's troubling behavior escalated. He began torturing small animals in secret, an act that he described in later writings as a way to feel alive. This behavior, coupled with his fascination with weapons, set off alarm bells for those around him. Yet, despite these warning signs, his family and teachers failed to intervene in any meaningful way. In many cases, they either downplayed his actions or ignored them entirely, chalking it up to youthful rebellion. Academically, Sakakibara struggled to maintain focus, which further alienated him from his parents and peers. He began skipping school, instead wandering the streets of Kobe or retreating to secluded areas where he could indulge in his fantasies without interruption. He carried knives with him and, by the age of 12, had started experimenting with homemade weapons. These acts gave him a sense of control and power that he lacked in his everyday life. Perhaps the most telling aspect of Sakakibara's fractured childhood was his growing hatred for authority figures and societal norms. He wrote extensively in journals about his disdain for humanity, often describing people as disgusting or weak. These writings revealed a deep-seated anger and a desire to rebel against a world he believed had rejected him. While many children experience feelings of alienation or struggle to find their place in the world, Sakakibara's journey was marked by a dangerous combination of psychological instability, a lack of empathy, and unchecked aggression. His childhood was not one of innocence lost but rather a slow descent into darkness, shaped by neglect, anger, and a fascination with the macabre. By the time Sakakibara reached his teenage years, the boy who had once killed a bird for fun had transformed into a young man consumed by violent fantasies. The stage was set for the horrors he would soon unleash, a grim culmination of a fractured childhood and a mind spiraling out of control. As Salitto Sakakibara entered adolescence, the turbulence of his early years deepened, casting a long shadow over his development. The challenges of his childhood, alienation, violence, and a lack of emotional support, intensified during this period, fostering a dangerous mix of rage, isolation, and a growing obsession with control through brutality. Adolescence is often a time of self-discovery and social connection, but for Sakakibara, it marked a further descent into isolation. By the age of 13, he had solidified his reputation as an outcast. While other boys his age were bonding over sports, video games, and shared teenage experiences, Sakakibara remained on the fringes of school life. His classmates described him as peculiar and intimidating, someone who oscillated between unsettling quietness and unpredictable bursts of aggression. Sakakibara rarely participated in class, often staring blankly out the window or doodling in his notebook. These drawings, later discovered, depicted violent and grotesque scenes, mutilated figures, blood-soaked weapons, and expressions of pain. They offered an unfiltered glimpse into his mind, revealing an internal world dominated by chaos and cruelty. Teachers, overwhelmed by the demands of managing large classrooms, often overlooked his behavior, failing to grasp its sinister implications. His relationship with his peers was no better. Bullied and ostracized, Sakakibara harbored deep resentment against those who shunned him. He began to develop a worldview where he positioned himself as superior to others, stronger, smarter, and more capable of understanding the harsh realities of life. This inflated sense of self-worth clashed with his real-world failures, fueling an intense hatred for those he deemed weaker or undeserving. During this period, Sakakibara's fascination with violence evolved into a full-blown obsession with death. He started to consume any media he could find that depicted death and suffering, from gory movies to true crime books detailing the acts of infamous serial killers. Unlike most teenagers who might view such material out of curiosity or rebellion, Sakakibara immersed himself in it with a disturbing intensity. He saw these killers not as cautionary tales but as figures of power and control, individuals who embodied his darkest fantasies. In his private writings, Sakakibara began exploring themes of domination and destruction. He detailed imagined scenarios where he inflicted pain on others, often describing these acts in graphic and chilling detail. He referred to himself as an executioner and spoke of a desire to cleanse the world of those he considered inferior. This language was not the product of idle teenage angst, it was a reflection of a deeply disturbed mind teetering on the edge of action. Sakakibara's fascination with death wasn't confined to fantasy. He began acting out his violent impulses on living creatures, starting with small animals. Dogs, cats, and birds became the targets of his sadism. He would lure them into traps, torture them, and, in some cases, kill them with knives or blunt objects. These acts gave him a sense of power and control, filling the void left by his feelings of inadequacy and rejection. His cruelty toward animals was accompanied by an increasing interest in weapons. Sakakibara collected knives and homemade tools of destruction, hiding them from his parents in a secret stash. He would practice using these weapons in secluded areas, honing his ability to inflict harm with precision. To him, these acts were a rehearsal for something greater, a manifestation of his belief that violence could elevate him above others. To outsiders, Sakakibara remained an unassuming, if slightly odd, teenager. He continued attending school and occasionally participated in family activities, maintaining a thin veneer of normalcy. However, beneath this facade lay a dual existence. At home, he poured his thoughts into a journal he called his Book of Death. In it, he detailed his fantasies, catalogued his feelings of superiority, and meticulously planned the acts of violence he longed to commit. The journal became a sanctuary for his darkest thoughts, a place where he could express the anger and hatred he kept bottled up in public. He wrote about his disdain for authority, his contempt for his classmates, and his desire to inflict suffering on those who had wronged him, or simply those who existed in his world. Over time, the journal took on an almost ritualistic significance, serving as both a diary and a blueprint for the horrors to come. There were moments when Sakakibara's behavior alarmed those around him. He once brought a knife to school, threatening to harm a classmate during an argument. On another occasion, he was caught vandalizing school property with disturbing graffiti that referenced death and violence. These incidents, while serious, were dismissed as the acts of a troubled but ultimately harmless teen. Even his parents, who were aware of his struggles, failed to grasp the gravity of his condition. His mother, though critical and overbearing, assumed that Sito's behavior was a form of rebellion that would pass with time. His father, distant as ever, made no attempts to intervene. The family's lack of understanding and action allowed Sakakibara's violent tendencies to fester unchecked. By the time he turned 14, Sakakibara had fully embraced his identity as a would-be predator. He no longer fantasized about violence in abstract terms, he was planning it. The anger that had simmered within him for years was now boiling over, pushing him closer to action. His fantasies of power and control demanded fulfillment, and he saw no reason to wait any longer. Adolescence, often a time of growth and opportunity, had become for Sakakibara a crucible of darkness. The combination of rejection, unchecked aggression, and an obsession with death forged him into a ticking time bomb. In the shadow of his teenage years, the boy who once killed animals for pleasure was preparing to turn his fantasies of violence into a horrifying reality. By 1997, 14-year-old Sito Sakakibara had crossed the threshold between fantasy and reality. The anger, alienation, and violent impulses he had harbored for years culminated in acts of unimaginable brutality. His writings had foretold his intentions, but few could have predicted the depth of his depravity or the impact it would leave on the city of Kobe, Japan. On March 16, 1997, Sakakibara claimed his first victim, a 10-year-old girl named Ayaka Yamashita. She had been walking to a friend's house when she encountered Sakakibara in a quiet residential area. Armed with a hammer, Sakakibara struck her repeatedly on the head, leaving her fatally injured. The suddenness and savagery of the attack left Ayaka no chance to defend herself. The crime shocked the local community. Police initially believed it to be a random act of violence, a one-off incident by an unknown assailant. They could not imagine that the perpetrator was a young teenager from their own neighborhood. Sakakibara, meanwhile, felt a twisted sense of satisfaction from the murder. He described it in his journal as a practice run, a stepping stone toward the larger acts of violence he envisioned. 2 months later, on May 27, 1997, Sakakibara escalated his violence in a crime that would horrify the nation. His target this time was 11-year-old June Hayes, a boy who attended a local special education school. June, like Ayaka, was lured into a false sense of security by the unassuming demeanor of his killer. Sakakibara attacked June with a knife, stabbing him multiple times before beheading him in a secluded area. The sheer brutality of the act demonstrated a chilling level of premeditation and an utter lack of empathy. For Sakakibara, this was not simply a murder, it was a statement. What truly set the murder of June Hayes apart was what Sakakibara did next. He placed the boy's severed head on the front steps of Tainohata Elementary School, the very school he had once attended. The gruesome display was accompanied by a note written in red ink, a taunt to both the authorities and the public. The note read, "This is the beginning of the game. Try to stop me if you can. I despise the decadent society in which I live, and I have chosen to revolt against it. I urge all who read this to see the truth I have discovered: life is worthless, and the strong must dominate the weak. Catch me if you can." The letter, signed with the pseudonym Sakakibara Sito, contained deliberate grammatical errors, further mystifying investigators. The use of his real surname as part of the alias was a disturbing blend of arrogance and carelessness, suggesting that Sakakibara wanted to be recognized, if not caught. The discovery of Jun's head sent shockwaves through Kobe and the rest of Japan. The brutality of the crime, combined with the taunting note, suggested that the killer was not only dangerous but deeply deranged. Parents in the city became terrified to let their children walk to school or play outside. The community, once considered a peaceful and safe place, was now gripped by fear. The police launched one of the largest manhunts in Japanese history. Investigators worked tirelessly to trace the source of the note and identify suspects. Yet, Sakakibara remained elusive. His age and outwardly unremarkable demeanor shielded him from suspicion. In the days following Jun Hei's murder, Sakakibara recorded his thoughts in his journal. He described the act with a disturbing detachment, referring to it as art and expressing pride in his ability to evade capture. He likened himself to historical figures and fictional antiheroes, claiming that his actions were part of a larger rebellion against society. For Sakakibara, the murders were not merely acts of violence but attempts to assert control over a world he felt had rejected him. His writings reflected a delusional belief that he was destined for greatness through infamy, and the murders were the first steps toward achieving that legacy. Despite his efforts to remain anonymous, Sakakibara began to make mistakes. Witnesses had seen a boy matching his description near the scene of Jun's murder. His letter to the police, while cryptic, contained subtle clues about his identity and mindset. As investigators pieced together the evidence, the net began to close around Sakakibara. Unbeknownst to him, the very notoriety he sought would ultimately lead to his undoing. But before the police could act, the city of Kobe would endure weeks of anxiety, fearing that the killer might strike again. Sakakibara had crossed the line from troubled adolescent to cold-blooded murderer, leaving a trail of pain and fear in his wake. The murders of Ayaka Yamashita and Jun Hei's were not only heinous crimes but also the manifestation of years of unchecked rage and a profound disconnection from humanity. Amid the police investigation and the rising terror in Kobe, a piece of evidence emerged that would become central to understanding the mind of Sito Sakakibara, a disturbing document he called his murder notebook. This handwritten journal, discovered during the search of his home after his arrest, provided a chilling window into his dark fantasies, detailed planning, and warped psyche. The notebook was a mix of chaotic scribblings, violent imagery, and methodical notes. It was a macabre diary of his thoughts, obsessions, and crimes. Forensic psychologists and law enforcement would later analyze the notebook extensively, using it to unravel Sakakibara's motivations and trace the development of his violent impulses. The pages of the notebook contained detailed accounts of the murders, written in a detached, almost clinical tone. Sakakibara described his attacks on Ayaka Yamashita and Jun Hei's, referring to them as projects and cataloging their execution with the precision of someone documenting an experiment. In one entry, he wrote about Ayaka's murder, calling it an introductory exercise. He detailed his emotions leading up to the act, nervousness, anticipation, and a strange exhilaration afterward. He expressed no remorse, only frustration at what he perceived as imperfections in his method. The sections about Jun Hei's were far more elaborate. Sakakibara described the planning phase, the tools he had selected, and the act of beheading with a disturbing mix of pride and detachment. He seemed fascinated by the act itself, calling it the moment of transcendence, as if the murder had elevated him to a higher state of being. The notebook also contained graphic illustrations. Among the most disturbing were depictions of mutilated bodies and severed heads, often accompanied by notes about anatomy and violence. The drawings were crude but vivid, betraying his obsession with death and suffering. Some pages featured symbols that experts later associated with rebellion and nihilism. One recurring image was a broken school bell, which Sakakibara explained in a later confession represented his hatred for the education system. Other symbols seemed more personal, including a crude depiction of a knife labeled "My Will," which he saw as a representation of his power over life and death. Interspersed with the detailed accounts of his crimes were rants about society, authority figures, and his peers. Sakakibara described a deep resentment toward his family, teachers, and classmates, whom he blamed for his feelings of alienation. He referred to them collectively as the sheep and wrote of his desire to punish them for their conformity and perceived hypocrisy. One passage read, "They follow the rules blindly, never questioning the system that crushes individuality. I will break their illusions and show them the truth of chaos and power." Sakakibara's writings frequently referenced his desire to create fear. He viewed terror as a form of control and a way to assert his dominance over a society he felt had marginalized him. The notebook was not just a record of his actions but a manifesto of his personal philosophy, one rooted in nihilism, sadism, and a craving for recognition. Unbeknownst to Sakakibara, his meticulous record-keeping would become a key piece of evidence against him. When police eventually searched his home, they discovered the notebook hidden among other personal belongings. Its contents corroborated the forensic evidence and eyewitness accounts, linking him definitively to the murders. The notebook also provided investigators with insights into his psychological state. While his actions had already painted him as a disturbed individual, the writings revealed a level of premeditation and self-awareness that undermined any argument that his crimes were impulsive or purely the result of mental illness. The murder notebook became infamous in the media after its existence was revealed during Sakakibara's trial. The public was horrified to learn of the level of detail and cold calculation in his writings. For many, the notebook was more than evidence of his guilt, it was a symbol of his complete moral detachment and the depth of his depravity. Psychologists who examined the notebook struggled to reconcile its contents with the image of a 14-year-old boy. The calculated language and graphic content suggested someone far older, someone who had spent years cultivating a fascination with violence. Yet, in Sakakibara's case, these traits had emerged during his formative years, raising uncomfortable questions about the societal and personal factors that had shaped him. The discovery of the notebook was a turning point in the case. It not only solidified the case against Sakakibara but also shattered any remaining illusions about his innocence. The evidence within those pages was irrefutable, painting a picture of a cold, methodical killer who took pleasure in his crimes. The notebook would remain one of the most notorious artifacts of the case, a chilling reminder of the darkness that had festered within Sakakibara and the horror it had unleashed on Kobe. For the families of his victims, it was a painful reminder of the suffering their loved ones had endured, but it also provided the prosecution with the tools they needed to secure justice. The capture of Salitto Sakakibara was the culmination of intense police work, public pressure, and the killer's own reckless need for recognition. His arrest marked the end of a reign of terror that had gripped Kobe, but it also revealed the vulnerabilities of a society unprepared to confront such malevolence in someone so young. The events leading to his capture unfolded in a series of tense, methodical steps as investigators pieced together the puzzle of his crimes. The breakthrough in the case came not from a direct clue left at the crime scenes, but from Sakakibara's own brazen communication with authorities. 2 weeks after Jun Hayes's severed head was discovered at the school gate, a letter arrived at the offices of the Kobe Shimbun, a prominent local newspaper. Written in a bold, chaotic hand, the message was chilling and defiant. "I am responsible for the murder of the child. This is the beginning of a game. I want you to stop me if you can, you incompetent fools." The letter was signed with the alias Salitto Sakakibara, a name later revealed to be a play on words involving Japanese characters that hinted at his twisted ideology. The letter's tone was both taunting and revelatory, providing a window into the mind of the killer. He sought not only to evade capture but to challenge the authorities, daring them to match his intellect and bring him to justice. The police immediately made the letter public, hoping someone would recognize the handwriting or style. The message stoked public fear and outrage, intensifying the pressure on investigators to find the perpetrator. Analysts scrutinized the language and structure of the letter, noting its mix of arrogance and immaturity, which hinted at a young but highly intelligent suspect. As the letter became a focal point, police also doubled down on physical evidence and witness reports. They revisited the crime scenes, looking for overlooked details, and re-interviewed residents near the locations where the bodies had been found. One significant lead emerged when a local resident reported seeing a young boy in the vicinity of the school on the night before June Hayes's head was discovered. The witness described him as wearing a school uniform and carrying a bag large enough to conceal the severed head. Though the description was vague, it narrowed the scope of the investigation to local school-aged children. Additionally, forensic analysis of the scene where June Hayes's head had been left uncovered traces of dirt and vegetation not native to the area but matching a nearby wooded park. Investigators theorized that the body may have been transported from that location, prompting a targeted search of the park and its surroundings. As the police worked tirelessly, a rumor began circulating in the local schools. Students whispered about a strange boy who had been openly boasting about violent fantasies and who seemed unusually interested in the details of the murders. Teachers, already on edge, took note of these conversations and quietly reported them to law enforcement. One name kept surfacing, a 14-year-old boy known for his antisocial behavior and erratic outbursts. His teachers described him as intelligent but deeply troubled, with a penchant for drawing violent images in his notebooks. While the boy's name was not initially released to the public, police began to focus their attention on him, conducting background checks and quietly surveilling his movements. With enough circumstantial evidence to warrant further investigation, police obtained a warrant to search the boy's home. On June 28, 1997, officers arrived at the modest house where Salitto Sakakibara lived with his family. The search quickly yielded damning evidence. In his room, investigators found items that tied him directly to the murders, including the blood-stained clothes he had worn during the attacks. They also discovered a collection of knives and tools consistent with the injuries inflicted on the victims. Most chilling of all was the murder notebook, which detailed his crimes in graphic, methodical detail, including sketches and entries about the killings. The evidence was overwhelming, leaving no doubt about his culpability. Sakakibara, who had been home during the search, was taken into custody without resistance. According to officers present, his demeanor was eerily calm, almost indifferent, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. In custody, Sakakibara initially refused to speak, sitting in silence as detectives pressed him for answers. However, under the weight of the evidence and skillful interrogation, he eventually began to open up. His confession was chilling in its clarity and lack of remorse. He described the murders in vivid detail, recounting how he had selected his victims, lured them to secluded areas, and carried out the attacks. He spoke of the thrill he felt during the acts and the sense of control it gave him. When asked why he had targeted children, he coldly explained that they were easier to manipulate and overpower, showing no empathy for his victims or their families. News of Sakakibara's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. That the killer was not only so young but also one of their own, a boy who had walked the same streets and attended the same schools as their children, was almost impossible to comprehend. Parents struggled to explain the events to their children, and the revelation of his age led to heated debates about juvenile crime and the effectiveness of the social and educational systems in identifying and addressing disturbed individuals. The media, which had dubbed him the Kobe Killer, now turned its attention to the question of how someone so young could commit such heinous acts. Psychologists, criminologists, and sociologists weighed in, offering theories about his upbringing, environment, and psychological state. Sakakibara's arrest marked the end of a terrifying chapter for Kobe but also the beginning of a long legal and societal reckoning. As he awaited trial, the evidence against him continued to mount, and the community braced itself for the difficult process of seeking justice for the lives he had taken. For the families of Ayaka Yamashita and June Hayes, the capture of their children's murderer brought a measure of relief but also deepened their grief. They now faced the harrowing reality of confronting the boy who had so senselessly taken their loved ones away. The trial of Salitto Sakakibara was one of the most polarizing legal proceedings in modern Japanese history. It sparked nationwide debates about justice, juvenile crime, and the capacity for rehabilitation in the face of unimaginable violence. The courtroom became a stage not just for the pursuit of justice, but for broader societal reflection on how to deal with a child capable of such horrifying acts. Given Sakakibara's age, 14 at the time of the murders, his case was handled within the framework of Japan's juvenile law, which prioritized rehabilitation over punishment. His identity was withheld in official proceedings, though the media's insatiable curiosity had already unearthed significant details about him. The secrecy around his identity added to public outrage, with many arguing that such anonymity shielded him from the full weight of accountability. The trial took place in a family court, but due to the severity of the crimes, prosecutors pushed for Sakakibara to be tried as an adult. Ultimately, the court ruled to retain his juvenile status, a decision that incited widespread anger and dismay. For many, the idea that someone who had committed such heinous acts could be treated as a minor was a bitter pill to swallow. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case, focusing on the brutality of Sakakibara's crimes and the premeditated nature of his actions. They highlighted the murder notebook, which detailed his plans and demonstrated a clear, calculated intent to kill. Physical evidence, including blood-stained clothes, the murder weapons, and items belonging to his victims found in his possession. His confession, in which he described his methods and motivations with chilling clarity. Forensic experts testified about the injuries sustained by Ayaka Yamashita and June Hayes, emphasizing the calculated violence involved in their deaths. Psychologists also weighed in, painting a picture of Sakakibara as a deeply disturbed individual with little regard for human life. Sakakibara's defense team focused on his age and psychological state, arguing that he was a product of his environment and mental health struggles. They pointed to his troubled upbringing, feelings of alienation, and lack of emotional support as factors that had warped his development. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Sakakibara exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, as well as deep-seated anger and resentment toward society. The defense argued that he was not irredeemable and could benefit from intensive psychiatric treatment and rehabilitation. While these arguments resonated with some, the public's response was overwhelmingly negative. Many viewed them as attempts to excuse the inexcusable. Throughout the proceedings, Sakakibara remained eerily calm, showing little emotion as the details of his crimes were recounted. His lack of visible remorse further alienated the public and fueled calls for harsher punishment. However, there were moments when his facade cracked. During one hearing, he reportedly spoke briefly about his loneliness and feelings of powerlessness, offering a glimpse into the troubled mind that had driven him to kill. Yet even these moments failed to garner much sympathy from the victims' families or the broader public. The court ultimately found Sakakibara guilty of the murders of Ayaka Yamashita and June Hayes. Due to his juvenile status, he was not eligible for the death penalty or life imprisonment. Instead, the court sentenced him to institutionalization in a juvenile correctional facility, with the length of his confinement dependent on his progress in rehabilitation. The decision sparked outrage across Japan. Many felt the sentence was too lenient for such brutal crimes, arguing that it failed to deliver justice for the victims and their families. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, with demonstrators calling for stricter penalties for juvenile offenders and reforms to Japan's juvenile law. For the families of the victims, the sentence was a devastating blow. June Hayes' parents, in particular, expressed profound disappointment, stating that no amount of rehabilitation could bring their son back or make up for the pain they had endured. Ayaka Yamashita's family, though less vocal, shared similar sentiments. Despite their grief, both families worked to channel their pain into advocacy, pushing for legal reforms to ensure that future cases of similar severity would not result in what they saw as a miscarriage of justice. Sakakibara's trial became a turning point in Japan's approach to juvenile crime. The case spurred a wave of public demand for changes to the juvenile law, leading to legislative amendments in 2000 that allowed for harsher penalties for minors involved in serious crimes. These reforms, often referred to as the Sakakibara law reforms, reflected a shift in societal attitudes toward balancing rehabilitation with accountability. The trial and sentencing of Salitto Sakakibara left a deep scar on Japanese society. While the legal system had done its duty within the constraints of the law, the broader questions raised by the case, about the nature of evil, the limits of rehabilitation, and the responsibility of society to prevent such tragedies, remained unanswered. For the families of the victims, the verdict marked the end of one chapter but the continuation of a lifetime of grief. For Sakakibara, it signaled the beginning of a period of incarceration that would test the limits of the justice system's capacity to reform a deeply troubled soul. Salitto Sakakibara was released in 2004, at the age of 21, having served just 7 years. His release reignited public anger and fear, as many questioned whether he had been truly rehabilitated. His whereabouts remain closely guarded, though rumors occasionally surface about his life post-incarceration. The case of Salitto Sakakibara remains one of Japan's most notorious crimes, a grim reminder of the potential for violence even in the youngest offenders. It forced a nation to confront difficult questions about mental health, juvenile justice, and the societal pressures that can contribute to such horrific acts. For many in Kobe and beyond, the wounds left by Sakakibara's crimes will never fully heal.